everyone, Chef Abby here from Whole Health Every Day. I am delighted to be back, still socially quarantining, still stuck at home. So I thought that I would present a couple of recipes to you that, number one, reminded me of happier times and also definitely reminded me of my childhood and were very comforting. I think we can all use a little bit of comfort during these kind of scary times. So today we are sort of reinventing and putting some grown-up twists on some childhood favorites. And by that, I mean we are talking about tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, but not just any tomato soup, a creamy tomato soup that has absolutely no cream in it. I'll show you how we do this in just a little bit. And then a grown-up version of a grilled cheese using some nicer, finer cheeses and just kind of amping it up a little bit. So we've got a lot to do, so we are going to get right into this. By the way, if you're tuning in, please go ahead and say hi. Let me know you're here. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them as I go through this. So we're going to start off with this tomato soup, and part of the goal was to make a tomato soup that tastes really tomatoey. So one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of eliminate any dairy products in this. Dairy products all have milk fat in them, and milk fat tends to sort of make the taste of everything else a little bit more subtle. So we're gonna eliminate all of the dairy. So you could actually start with butter if you were doing this, but I am going to start by heating up some extra virgin olive oil in my pot here. Now this makes quite a bit of soup, so you'll want to have a large pot or a nice big Dutch oven to go ahead and make this. And we're going to get this going on about medium-high heat. And basically what I want to do is wait until my oil starts to shimmer. And what I mean by that is there's sort of a visual cue that you can use to determine that your oil is ready enough to move on to the next step. Number one, you'll notice that the way that it moves in the pan or in the pot will change. It will go from kind of lollygagging from side to side to moving very quickly across the pan. And you will also start to see a bit of a shimmer or a ripple effect in the oil. And that's how you know your oil is going to be nice and hot and ready for you to saute whatever you're working with. So while that heats up, let's talk a little bit about some other ingredients that are going to go into this. We've got, of course, our aromatics. And I've got one yellow onion that I diced pretty finely. Eventually, this soup is going to go into the blender, so this is not a situation where you have to have really fine knife cuts, but just know that the smaller you cut your onions in the beginning, the more quickly they're going to soften, and the more quickly you'll be able to have this really delicious soup. So this is one yellow onion that I chopped nice and fine. We're also going to be adding some minced garlic into this, and then we're going to be working with some dried herbs and spices. So I've got some red pepper flakes, a little bit of onion powder, a little bit of garlic powder, and then we're going to throw a bay leaf in there as well. So go ahead and check on my oil here. I can see that it's nice and shimmery, moving side to side from in the pot. So we'll add the onions in. I hear a nice sizzle, so that's a good indication that I gave that oil time to do what it needed to do. And at this point, I'm also going to add some salt. Now, you may have heard chefs say that when they're cooking, they like to season in layers because that will allow you to develop layers of flavor in your food as opposed to just adding all the seasoning in at the end. But in terms of adding salt to aromatics in the beginning of cooking, this is also going to help speed up the softening process on those onions. Salt is what we call hygroscopic, or it has hygroscopic properties, which means that when you add it to aromatics, it actually draws the moisture out of the aromatics and creates more steam in your pot, which will allow your onions to soften through more quickly. Now, as I said, the tomatoes are the star of this show. So this is not a situation where you really need to get the onions to the point where they're starting to brown. You just want them to be soft enough that they'll blend nicely in the blender so that you end up with a really nice creamy soup. So we're going to let those go for just a minute or so while they soften and start to become translucent, and then we'll be able to move on to the next step. Now, this is a tomato soup, so of course we need some sort of tomato product in this. And actually, we're going to be using whole peeled canned tomatoes for this. And there's a couple of reasons why we're using canned tomatoes. Number one, this is a super pantry friendly soup. So we wanted this to be something that you could make pretty much any day of the week using pantry staples. But also, it's important to understand that tomato season doesn't last very long. Usually it's at the very end of summer. Here in Arizona where I live, or where I grew up in Ohio, the time span for really great tomatoes lasted like 2.5 weeks, and then sort of the rest of the year you get something that's kind of mealy and pink and doesn't really have a whole lot of flavor. So using a canned tomato product is definitely advisable because these are canned right at their peak of freshness. The other great thing about using a whole peeled canned tomato is that they're already peeled for you. So again, this is super quick cooking and this will save you a little bit of time. So we're going to be using 2 full cans of whole peeled tomatoes. So we'll just set those aside for a moment and we'll check on our onions. All right, these are looking good. They become slightly translucent. So at this point, we'll add in our other aromatics. So we've got a couple of cloves of garlic that are going in there. And as I said, those dried spices. So some garlic powder, some onion powder, some chili flakes. Now, the chili flakes are an optional ingredient, and you can use as much or as little as you like. I happen to like my food a little bit on the spicier side, so I'm going to use quite a few chili flakes in my soup, and also a bay leaf. Now, when I'm working with dried herbs and spices, I always like to add them to fat. And that's because dried herbs and spices are fat soluble, which means when you add them in the pot and they're coated in the oil, it's actually going to make them taste more pronounced. Their flavor is going to be bolstered and fortified, and they'll just taste even better. So pretty much at this point, once you can smell them, that's a good indication that you can move on to the next step. So now we are ready for our tomatoes. Now these are packed in juice. When you're looking for your canned tomatoes, it will either tell you that they're packed in juice or in puree. And you want to find the ones that are packed in juice so that the consistency of your soup is correct. Now, as in their whole form, the tomatoes are not going to break down very quickly, so I'm just going to use a potato masher to kind of break my tomatoes into some smaller pieces. You really want pieces that are only about 1 inch big. If you don't have a potato masher, no problem. You can take your tomatoes, put them in a bowl, and use your hands to do this. Really, any way you want to do this is absolutely fine, but a potato masher makes some nice quick work of this. So once these get into about 1/2 inch or so pieces, we can address the creamy element of this tomato soup. But before I do that, I'm also going to add in some brown sugar. This is a really balanced soup, and the thing to know is that the brown sugar that we're adding here obviously isn't going to make this taste sweet at all, but it will help to kind of balance out the natural tartness that tomatoes have. I'm using just regular brown sugar here, but if you're somebody who is trying to make really healthy sugar substitutions, absolutely. You could certainly use a monk fruit type sugar substitution here. Anything that you want that will give this just a little bit of sweetness to balance out the tartness of those tomatoes will work. Now, at this point, we can talk about this creamy factor. So I told you that I wanted a dairy-free tomato soup, but on their own, the tomatoes just don't have enough body to make this really luxurious and creamy. So we're actually taking a bit of a cue from European cuisine in general. Oftentimes, especially in the old days, bread was used to thicken soups and stews and things like that. You throw a little bit of day-old bread in there, and suddenly you have more soup to feed more people, and it's more cost effective. So actually, that's what we're going to be using today. This is just 4 slices of a hearty white sandwich bread. Now, if you're gluten-free, you absolutely could use a gluten-free bread product here, but you just want to make sure that the crusts are removed, and this will be fine if you're using fresh bread. Stale bread doesn't matter because it's going to be completely saturated in the soup. So this is 4 slices, and I just cut these into about 1/2 inch pieces. Again, so that I could speed this up and we could get through this a little bit more quickly. So we're going to just mix that into the soup, and we're just going to let this simmer on the stove here for about 5 minutes or so. I also like to limit the cooking time on this because the more that you boil down and simmer down those tomatoes, the less pronounced their flavor actually is. So by doing this pretty quickly, we preserve the really bright, fresh taste of those tomatoes. We're just gonna pop a lid on that and let that hang out. And while that simmers for about 5 minutes or so on about medium-high heat, we're gonna actually move over to our grilled cheeses here. We're working kind of in tandem. We're doing a couple things at once, but I prepared all of this in advance, so have no fear, I am in control. Now, grilled cheese sandwiches are great. And when I was growing up, that meant white bread and Kraft American cheese, and very specifically not the type that came wrapped in plastic, the deluxe that came in slices. And I could tell the difference if my mom tried to sneak in the other type of cheese. And the thing to know about American cheese is that it's a processed cheese, and there are lots of things that make that not so great. We're trying more and more as much as we can to not eat processed foods. But the thing about American processed type cheeses that makes it so great for a grilled cheese or something like that is because it's an excellent melter. It's a young cheese with a high smoke point. So in trying to figure out a way to make a grilled cheese that used a little bit fancier cheese, you had to figure out that moisture issue, because what happens when cheese ages is that it dries out and it loses moisture. So that's why oftentimes when you're working with something like a sharp cheddar or an extra sharp cheddar and you're trying to use it at high heat or melt it, it tends to break. It's just because the fat and the proteins in the cheese can't hold on to one another and they separate, and that's how you end up with something really greasy. But the cool thing to know is that there is a way around that, and that's by pairing a cheese that has less moisture with a younger, more high moisture cheese. So we're actually going to be using a combination of cheeses in our grilled cheese today. I've got some Gruyere cheese that I've cut into cubes, and I've also got some 2 ounces of brie cheese. And now this has all been sitting out at room temperature because the end goal here is to get this into a really nice paste. Now for time's sake, I'm actually going to do this in a food processor, but have no fear, if you don't have a food processor, what you would want to do would be shred the cheese on the small holes of a box grater and you'll get the same results. So all of my cheese, which has been sitting at room temperature, is going to go into the food processor. Now using that brie in this mixture is going to help so that there's a little bit of added moisture here, but we're also going to add a little bit more moisture to this in the form of some dry white wine. If you've ever had fondue, obviously usually fondue is not made with something like an American cheese. It's usually made with a really high quality cheese, and it turns out that what they do when they're making fondue is actually include some wine and some flour in the mixture, and that helps those nicer, more aged cheeses not break when they're melted. So 2 tablespoons of a dry white wine, something that you would drink, into the food processor. Now if you're somebody who prefers not to cook without alcohol, that's okay, no worries. You could substitute out some milk, you could substitute out some water or some chicken broth, just 2 tablespoons of some liquid in here to make sure that you've got enough moisture content in your cheese mixture. I also am going to add some chives to this. This is again how we're adding a little bit more grown up flavor to these grilled cheeses. So what we're going to do is pop the lid on and just process this until we have a nice smooth. Only takes 30 or 45 seconds or so. You'll probably want to go in there, scrape down the sides to make sure that everything is getting nice and processed. Again, if you were doing this without a food processor, you would just need to use a little elbow grease and get in there with a nice sturdy spatula and just mix it together until you've got something that's really nice and cohesive. I'm going to give this just one more whirl and then we'll be ready to go. All right, that that looks really good. I'll pull this up to the camera so that you can hopefully see. It's just a nice kind of spreadable paste that will be easy to get onto our bread. So we'll set that aside for just a moment and we'll talk about the bread. Now today I'm using a marble rye bread for this. This is really one of those areas where you could get really creative. You don't have to use rye bread. You could use any nice hearty sandwich bread that you like. Certainly you could use a gluten-free bread here if you are gluten-free. But we need to address how we're going to get some browning on the outside of this. And there's lots of different ways to get that browning. Some people like to put butter in a pan. Some people like to spread butter on the bread, but I today am actually using mayonnaise instead of butter. Mayonnaise has a lot of fat in it, so it browns really well, and it gives the crust a kind of a little bit of a tang, which I think is really great. Now, we're gonna take this a step further in that tangy kind of factor, and we're also going to add in some Dijon mustard to our mayonnaise. So basically, we're doing a really quick version of an aioli here. This is just gonna, again, give us a little bit more flavor and just make this a little bit more grown up in terms of a typical grilled cheese. So just quickly mix that together and then we'll spread this onto our bread. Now for time's sake, I'm only going to make 2 of these sandwiches. The recipe, which you can find on the Whole Health Everyday website, I think that it's right down there at the bottom of the screen, will make 8 sandwiches. So keep in mind that this mixture is obviously not going to go on these 2 sandwiches. It will make quite a bit more than that. So I'm just going to dollop a little bit of my mayonnaise and Dijon mixture over all 4 of my pieces of bread. And then using my offset spatula here, this is a really handy tool for things like this. I'm just going to spread this in a really nice thin layer over the bottom, or over the tops, excuse me, of each of these 4 pieces of bread. This is not a situation where more is more. You really only need a small amount of this to get that nice browning. Plus, these are pretty decadent, so you don't want to go crazy with adding too much fat to the outside of each of your 4 pieces of bread. Now, we'll turn 2 of these over and we will add our cheese mixture onto the other side. And I'm just gonna quickly dollop some of this right into the middle of each of these. And as you're spreading out your cheese paste, you do want to kind of be aware to leave a little bit of a border. This is going to obviously melt and expand as we cook our grilled cheeses. So we want to give that somewhere to go. And again, just using my offset here, you just kind of smush it down and leave that about 1/4 inch border for each of these. Now these are going to go into a non-stick skillet, and what you'll want to do is actually preheat your non-stick skillet for about a minute or 2 prior to putting your sandwiches in there. I'm going to turn my skillet on medium-low and allow it to quickly preheat. Somebody's calling my mom, that's what you're hearing in the background. I'm using a non-stick skillet here, and sometimes people feel a little bit strange about heating a non-stick skillet with nothing in it. It used to be that if you heated non-sticks up to a certain temperature, they would produce a dangerous fume. The good thing to know is that all manufacturers of non-stick skillets have now removed that chemical from the processing of their non-stick skillets, so the stakes are not as high. But if you feel a little strange about heating a skillet without anything in it, by all means you could add a little bit of oil to the skillet to kind of gauge where it is, but then you'll just want to make sure that you wipe that oil out of the skillet before you add your sandwiches. And the good thing about heating this for a while is that oftentimes even the best skillets, even the best stoves have hot spots. And so by allowing the entire pan to heat for a limited period of time, that will alleviate those hot spots for the most part, and you'll get more even browning on your sandwiches. So I'm just going to quickly pull these together and then we will get these into our skillet. Now we're on medium-low heat here, and you want to leave it on medium-low heat while you do this so that we get nice even browning. So both of my sandwiches will go into the skillet, and have no fear, I will show you what these look like when they are finished. And these are pretty quick cooking, so we're going to let them go for about 2 minutes or so on that first side. We'll flip them over and allow them to go for 2 minutes on the second side, and then we'll let them rest. So in the meantime, while those are getting nice and golden brown on that first side, we'll take a look at our soup here, and we'll see that the bread has all gotten really nice and saturated, and it's looking absolutely delicious. So at this point, we are ready to go ahead and blend this soup. I will kind of hold this up. Ooh, getting a little tomato soup facial there, so that you can see what it looks like at this point. Maybe not, this is sort of a difficult angle, but the bread is super saturated here, and I now know that this can go into the blender. But before I do that, I am going to remove that bay leaf, because bay leaf doesn't really break down even in a really powerful blender, so you always want to take that out. Now, the thing to keep in mind about bay leaves, this is something that I always find kind of interesting, is that a lot of people think that bay leaves don't impart a lot of flavor unless you're doing something that's a really long cooking dish. But that's not actually the case. You can get a lot of flavor out of a bay leaf in something that's short and quick cooking, as long as your bay leaves are fresh. And I think that's kind of the key there. I think bay leaves are one of those things that sometimes get forgotten in the back of the spice cabinet, and they have a really short shelf life. Bay leaves actually only last about 3 months if you're just storing them in your pantry on your spice shelf. But what I like to do is actually store my bay leaves in, transfer them out of the original container that they come in, and I like to store mine in the freezer in an airtight container, and you'll get a lot longer life out of your bay leaves if you store them that way. So I've only got half of my soup here in the blender. Anytime you're working with something hot, you never want to fill the blender more than 2/3 of the way full. And you also always want to make sure that you're taking some extra precautions. Number one, this little piece on the blender, go ahead and take it off if you're blending something hot, because there's going to be quite a bit of steam in here. And if you leave that piece on and there's no airflow in your blender, you're ending up building a whole bunch of pressure, and you'll end up with tomato soup on your ceiling, which is never something that any of us desire. But now, of course, got a big hole in the top of my blender, so I am going to take a towel, and just to give myself a little bit of safety here, we'll pop the towel on top and we'll let this go. I'm also checking to make sure that my blender is on the lowest setting right now, because we want to kind of let this start moving around in the blender before we turn it on high and really get it going. So I like to get it just a couple of pulses, and then you can let it go. This is looking good. Again, depending on how powerful your blender is, about 1 to 2 minutes on this is really all you need. And again, this is only half of the soup, so you'll want to have a big bowl at the ready to transfer this in so that you can blend the other half. And we just spent all this time getting this really nice and creamy, so you will want to make sure that you clean out your pot before you add the soup back in. Now, there are just a couple more ingredients that are going to go in this, actually one more ingredient that's going to go into this, and that's some chicken broth. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't add the chicken broth at the beginning, which is I think what we normally do when we're making soups, but it just turns out that if you try to add the broth, there's just too much liquid in the blender, and the bread doesn't get properly soaked up and get incorporated really well. So by waiting until after the soup has been blended, it just makes it so that you end up with something that is really super creamy. Now, I didn't have any in my house, But if you really wanted to kind of add the little pièce de résistance to this soup, by all means, a couple of tablespoons of brandy in here right at the end would be great. So this is actually enough broth for all of it, and since I only did have 1 cup of good quality chicken broth, low sodium probably, so that you can control the salt content in this. If you want to make this completely vegetarian, absolutely, you could substitute out vegetable broth. Vegetable broth does tend to be a bit sweeter than chicken broth, so you may have to add a little bit more red pepper flake or something like that to kind of make it so that the soup doesn't taste too sweet. So we're just going to put that back on the stove. Really, we just want it to simmer for a couple of minutes, 3 to 4 minutes maximum, so that that chicken broth has a chance to heat up and the whole mixture is nice and warm. And then you'll be able to serve the soup. Now, this makes a lot of soup, so absolutely you should know that this freezes beautifully. A couple of quick tips about eating soups or really anything that has been frozen. You always want to make sure that you store it in a freezer safe container, and always make sure that you're bringing your soups up to a full boil before you serve them if they've been frozen. So just some food safety tips there. I'm gonna take a peek at my grilled cheese sandwiches. I'll pull one of these over so you can see. Beautiful golden brown. Now, again, that was super fast, but because we made that mixture into such a nice paste, the cheese has been fully melted through, but we do want to give this maybe a minute or two so that that cheese kind of sets up a little bit. Basically, same principle as if you were making a lasagna or something like that. You want the cheese to have time to set up a bit so that it doesn't end up kind of oozing out everywhere. So while that sits, I will grab a bowl here and we can serve up some of this awesome tomato soup. And you could garnish this with pretty much anything you like. You could eat it just like it is. Today, I am just going to simply top my soup with a couple of chives and a little bit of extra virgin olive oil. So a sprinkle of chives on there, a drizzle of extra virgin olive oil right over the top. Makes it look elegant, makes it look classy, and that is as easy as that. I hope you liked my version of grilled cheese and tomato soup. I hope you'll try this at home. Everybody stay safe, healthy, and happy, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.